Undercover view of a bumper joint, a retail outlet for the sale of moonshine whiskey. The bumper joint is the house on the corner, the one with artificial brick siding and the small mailbox alongside the front door. It has no neon signs, no being anything but an ordinary home. But for a considerable period of time, this place had hundreds of visitors daily, almost all of whom came to buy illegal whiskey. The customers seldom used the front door. They usually walked down the alleyway between the shine joint and the house next to it and went in the back door. The business this place did would make any legal retailer envious. For 2 full weeks, a Television 4 cameraman lived across the street and down the block from this house. With his concealed camera and set of long lenses, he took film of the traffic in and out of the house. He made an accurate count of the people who patronized the place. He saw and filmed an amazing panorama of life and activity on this street, all geared to the whiskey outlet on the corner. The surveillance of this bumper joint was one phase of a 10-month-long undercover investigation by WJXT into the thriving business of selling moonshine in Jacksonville. Tonight, on this special report, you'll see the untold story of the way this major vice flourishes in your own backyard and what it does to your community.
WJXT presents the 28th program in its public affairs series, Project 4. Tonight, the Moonshine Merchants.
This is West State Street in Jacksonville, less than a mile from downtown. This is the way it looks now, relatively quiet. Nothing like it was in the early part of 1962, when it contained one of the busiest bumper joints in the entire city. This is 1049 West State Street. When Television 4 began a lengthy investigation into the moonshine retail trade, this house served as living quarters for George Barrett, who used the back rooms of the house for an illegal whiskey operation. Across the street and down the block about 50 yards stands this 2-story apartment house, the bottom floor of which was rented by WJXT. It looks neat enough on the outside, but inside it was nothing more than a filthy shack, infested with rats and other vermin and festooned with dirt. It was home for Channel 4 photographer George Brolin for 2 full weeks, and once he got inside, he never went out. Getting him inside was not easy. His bulky cameras, tripod, film, and other equipment were carefully wrapped and smuggled in, along with this truckload of miscellaneous items of old furniture. Brolin himself sneaked in at 4 o'clock one morning. Inside, he covered all the windows and mounted his camera at the window on the front side of the house. The angle from this window was not at all ideal, but a lesson learned quickly and hammered home relentlessly is that undercover operations like this are almost never under ideal conditions. The job of filming from the house was a constant battle of wits and nerves, trying to get good pictures without being detected by passers-by on the street or by children playing on the front porch only inches away. The small details of this undercover operation make up a fascinating tale in themselves, and they demonstrate the extreme difficulty of making a film record of even a flagrant vice operation when everything you're doing has to remain completely concealed. Out on the street, the great bulk of human activity was tied to the bumper joint on the corner. State Street itself is not a thoroughfare and is only 1 block away from busy US 1 and from the expressway. It was bustling like a thoroughfare nonetheless. In advance planning for this surveillance, the State Beverage Department singled out this bumper joint as one of the busiest in existence, and this became readily apparent at the outset. Traffic into and out of the Shine House went on virtually all the time, from very early in the morning until very late at night. The path between these houses was not a shortcut to somewhere else. Almost all the people using it were going to the rear of Barrett's house, where a guard standing watch at the back door would let them inside. Many other customers got to the house by using a pathway from the rear. On one of the earliest days of the surveillance, a Saturday, 155 customers were counted going into the place in a space of 1 hour. automobile traffic often choked the block with everything from moving vans to pickup trucks disgorging customers. Double parking was necessary much of the time. This is the end of the line in moonshine's trip from still to consumer. It's usually made out in the woods in crude, often filthy distilleries, is transported to wholesalers in the city in 5-gallon or 1-gallon containers in every conceivable type of vehicle. Then is sold to operators of bumper joints like this one. The term bumper joint, incidentally, derives from the fact that you can get quite a bump from a shot of moonshine whiskey. All of the varied steps in producing and distributing shine are carried on as secretly as possible, since they're in violation of state and federal laws. Strangely enough, it's no violation to sell moonshine, although it is to possess it. Possession is illegal chiefly because taxes have not been paid on it, and these are quite substantial. On a gallon of whiskey, the federal and state taxes amount to $12.67, a fact most of these people probably are unaware of. During our 2-week vigil over this bumper joint, an undercover agent went down the path and into this house almost every day, confirming the fact that huge quantities of shine were being sold inside and that customers were often packed in the rear rooms like sardines. Things were frequently so congested that the guard at the back door kept people waiting in line outside and would allow a new customer in only as another one came up. The agent estimated one day that the man collecting money for the drinks had a roll of bills 4 inches thick. During the surveillance period, the policy of this house was usually one that required you to do your drinking on the spot, with nothing permitted to go outside. On at least 2 occasions, however, our agent was permitted to buy half a pint and take it with him. There were tragic overtones involving the bumper joint, such as the fact that small children lived in the house and often played among the customers, evidence that a new generation is getting a good indoctrination in the art of flouting the law. On the night of February 16th, a state beverage agent who had slipped into the observation house to assist in the lookout job saw the ugly result of a stabbing that apparently had taken place in the area of the bumper joint. He saw several men half leading and half carrying another man who held his hand over his bleeding stomach, taking him to a point down the street. As the group passed the window of the agent's house, one of them said, "I should have cut his guts out." A short time later, an ambulance and police arrived to pick up the man, but by then he was far removed from the house on the corner. There were also some lighter aspects to the game of watching from the window. At almost any given time, at least one automobile or truck parked in the street would have the hood raised to create the impression of engine trouble, which would justify being parked in the block. Sometimes, when 2 men would drive up in a car, they'd raise the hood and take turns, one pretending to work on the engine while the other went into the shine joint. About half the customers of the place showed various signs of being nervous about going down the path. Very frequently, they would look both ways up and down the street before making the plunge. These 3 men provide a classic example of the caution shown by some. Their actions tell a story for which words are a poor substitute. Watch what they do. At this point, photographer George Brolin might have given up since they seemed to have passed the place, but on a hunch, he decided to stay with them. And there they go. There were also some frustrating times for the observers at the window. It was tough enough to peek through a slit in the curtain and have to guess at exposure settings, but sometimes huge trucks would block the view and the camera became useless. Inside the observation house, life was a minimum sort of existence. Photographer Brolin was confined almost all of the time to the small front room, which offered absolutely nothing in the way of creature comforts. It was dirty, smelly, cold, crawling with bugs. He was deprived of the luxury of a shower or a shave for the full 2 weeks. His small room did have a couple of visitors, however, including the beverage agent who shared part of the 2 weeks with him, and another WJXT operative who was slipped in for a few days to help out. Keeping an undercover operation like is a tricky exercise in risks. At least once a day, he was met on a downtown street and given a paper bag containing food and a new roll of film. In exchange, he handed over another bag containing the day's supply of exposed film, which was then secretly processed. Hot meals, of course, were out of the question, and fried chicken was repeatedly on the menu. The one luxury of this operation was a private telephone over which advice, instructions, and information could be relayed to the men in the house. Although the number was unlisted, Brolin got at least 3 calls a day, every day, for someone who wanted very badly to speak to a Flossie White. Not the least of the problems was the sizable one of explaining to Brolin's colleagues at WJXT just where he had gone for a 2-week period. The endless complexities and frequent setbacks encountered in this lookout operation drove home forcibly the fact that this work is not a casual exercise. You rapidly acquire respect for the patience, time, and money required to use this technique effectively. George Barrett's bumper joint hummed with activity in a fairly predictable pattern. Thursday was a slow day, probably because it was just before payday. Saturday and Sunday were the biggest days. Sunday almost had the appearance of family day, with more men bringing along wives and children. On an average day, customers would begin their visits at 6 or 6:30 in the morning. On Sunday, the men in the lookout house made an all-day check on the number of customers making an appearance at the bumper joint. They did a head count on those using this front entrance, added a reasonable estimate of those coming in from the rear, and came up with the fantastic total of more than 1,400 customers over just a 10-hour period. At certain times, it was obvious that watchdogs were on the prowl in the vicinity of the Shine House to watch for the arrival of beverage agents. Some of them, in fact, were equipped with whistles to sound the warning so the people inside could get rid of the evidence if it became necessary. The observers in the house noted no scarcity of police cars during the 2 weeks. They patrolled the neighborhood with regularity and often parked at the opposite end of the block. On 4 occasions, policemen were seen going into the bumper joint itself, and on one occasion were observed laughing with some of the regular habitués of the place. We have no idea of the purpose of their visits, but moonshine was sold before they came and after they left. The profits derived from an operation like this one can only be guessed at, but they must be sizable. If 1,400 customers walked into the place in less than a day and spent only 25 cents apiece, the gross take would exceed $350 for that one day alone. And bear in mind that no beverage taxes are paid, no state sales tax, no income tax. Since these people will consume liquor in any case, the state could be gaining considerable revenue if they were simply abiding by the law and consuming tax-paid whiskey. The net loss to Florida each year is some $10 million in unpaid taxes. One of the cardinal rules for running a bumper joint is that you don't keep much moonshine on hand at any one time. In this way, if the beverage agents happen to drop in, you can probably get rid of what you have on hand by pouring it out, so there'll be little or nothing left for evidence. Although Barrett usually kept only a jug or two on hand at any one time, he had an ample supply known as a stash, hidden in a field less than 50 yards away. On numerous occasions, our observers saw runners lugging gallon-sized bottles of the stuff into the house from the field. This man driving an old light-colored Chevrolet aroused much suspicion because of the frequency of his arrival at the shine joint. The fact that he was sometimes carrying big 5-gallon cans inside made him a prime suspect as a delivery boy for whiskey, although it turned out that the cans probably contained something else, perhaps fuel oil. The day of reckoning for this bumper joint on State Street arrived 2 weeks after surveillance began. For as long as we observed it, and probably for a long period of time before that, it had done a land office business. It was as wide open an operation as can possibly be imagined. On the night of February 23rd, a raiding party of state beverage agents and deputies from the sheriff's office assembled to plan an assault on Barrett's house. Raids have long since become routine, both to the revenuers and to the moonshiners. And there's a continuing battle of wits with one side trying to outfox the other. The chief problem for the beverage agents is to get inside the bumper joint quickly enough to confiscate evidence before it can be poured out, while at the same time observing the letter of the law on search procedures. When the agents swooped in at 1 a.m. on a Friday night, they netted quite a haul. They got the operator, George Barrett, 2.5 gallons of moonshine, and half a dozen customers. The interior of the house we had watched for 2 weeks assuredly was no cocktail lounge, nor could it measure up to the average neighborhood tavern. It was simply a dirty, cluttered building which doubled as a residence and a bumper joint. Barrett had to watch. Agents searched the entire house for moonshine and for empty bottles which might be used for takeout orders. When they found bottles hidden in various places, they proceeded to smash them. State law dictates that possession of moonshine whiskey in an amount less than a gallon is a misdemeanor and may be punished by a fine of $500 or by 6 months in jail or both. Possession of a gallon or more, however, is a felony, and the offender can get 5 years or $5,000 or both. Because these penalties are potentially so stiff, bumper joint operators take great pains to foil beverage agents. And the irony is that they are able to do this so successfully while still operating in a casual, flagrant manner. Their chief tactic is to keep as little on hand as possible, and in most joints this means a gallon or less. But a stash is almost always located nearby, which can be tapped to replenish supplies as they run low. Most operators also keep the shine in huge pots or open containers, which can be dumped down the drain or flushed down the toilet at the first hammer of an agent's fist on the door. On the night of the raid, a number of small children were asleep in the house, and most managed to sleep through the noisy interruption. For George Barrett, who is shown here being searched along with the others, it was a bad night, if only for the inconvenience it caused. He was no stranger to the intrusion, however. He's been through this process before. This raid did not close the chapter on George Barrett. On the day following the raid, beverage agents had sufficient cause to believe the place was back in business again, and a second raid was set up for Sunday night, only 2 days after the first. This time, the agents concealed themselves in a small truck for the ride to State Street. When the second raid was triggered, the place had an even larger number of customers inside. As they scampered out the front and rear doors, they were collared by lawmen and arrested. Inside, the house reeked with the smell of moonshine, which had been hurriedly dumped on the floor to get rid of as much as possible. Much of the floor area in the back of the house glistened with the stuff and made a slippery mess. Agents managed to salvage half a gallon, 2 quarts for evidence. This time, Barrett and his family were loudly indignant. They cursed, shouted, and screamed defiance at the raiding party, even accused the beverage agents of bringing the evidence in with them. In a place saturated with the smell of shine, and which had been doing a bustling business for a long time, it was ludicrous to hear the occupants of the house denounce the intruders for barging in on law-abiding folks who possessed and professed to have nothing to do with moonshine.
49 West State Street. Zach
Every night I was chopping down the damn.
In a garage, in the back, a fresh supply of bottles was found. Thus, for the second time in less than 48 hours, Barrett and his helpers were hustled off to the Duval County Jail. On July 20th, 1962, George Barrett was tried in criminal court on the charge of possession of non-tax-paid whiskey found in his house during the first raid by beverage agents in February. He pleaded guilty to possession of 1 quart of moonshine and was fined $100 by the judge. He was never tried on the evidence seized in the second raid. The case was no prost, which means that prosecution was not pursued because of a technical error involved in investigating the case. Thus, for the second time in a little over 6 months, Barrett was tried, convicted, and fined in a state court for beverage law violations. Thus came to an end the first phase of our investigation into the moonshine retail racket in the Jacksonville area, a phase which provided some indication of how wide open and busy just a single bumper joint could be. Next came many weeks of research, studying court records, interviewing, compiling material, and evaluating the stacks of data we had gathered. Then in the fall of 1962, WJXT was ready to launch the second phase of its investigation, again with the cooperation of the State Beverage Department. We decided to try to capture on film some idea of how extensive the racket is, and we concluded that a camera concealed on some kind of vehicle might take us at least to the front door of as many different places as possible.